on the question of the huge media speculation about a so-called land bridge between the Russian border, Mariupol, down to Crimea, this is simply a misnomer. I don't believe, after visiting Mariupol, it's actually ever going to be possible. Why? Not only are there a lot of Ukrainian forces on the ground, we have the Azov Battalion defending Mariupol, and highly popular amongst the Russian-speaking population of Mariupol. Azov officers told me, for example, that if they were hanging around coffee bars, often locals would pay for their bills. Because they know that Azov are a guarantee that Mariupol will not end up like Donetsk Airport or Debaltseve. And the last thing people want is death and destruction. But besides Azov, you have the Donbas Battalion. I met the commander, Semenchenko, who's a member of Ukrainian parliament from Samopomich. And you have just regular Ukrainian troops based in Volnovakhe and elsewhere, a huge number of them with equipment, and again, highly motivated. For Russia to try to create a land bridge, and it's a huge area we're talking about, including two very pro-Ukrainian oblasts, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Zaporizhia, Russia would have to use 50,000 minimum, but more likely up to 100,000 troops. Then we're no longer talking about hybrid war, we're talking about a full-scale Russian-Ukrainian war, which would have massive international ramifications. The big question is, could Russia muster that many troops? I don't think so. Russia has about 10% of its forces are very well trained, so-called green men, special forces working in the military or through the GRU, the military intelligence. But the 90% of the Russian forces are still in a complete catastrophic state. And for the offensive in Debaltseve, they had to bring in Mongolian, Buryat troops from the Chinese border. So that shows you the degree to which it's very difficult for them to mobilize forces, especially on such a large scale. The political vacuum has been filled by Ukrainian civil society activity. At the same time, Mariupol is a great example of how oligarchs should be removed from Ukrainian politics. Mariupol is a factory town. It's the most polluted city in Europe, at least certainly in Ukraine. You see spews of pollution. In a Western democracy, a European democracy, probably those factories will be closed down, just as the coal mines in the Donbas would have been closed down, because Ukraine has the second largest accident rate in coal mines after China in the world. These factories are owned by Rinat Akhmetov, maybe one or two by Sergei Taruta. One factory in Mariupol is 9 miles long, an old Soviet monolith with thousands of workers, and these workers are basically like 19th century serfs. They're slaves. Their entire existence is tied to the factory through kindergartens, collective farms, and others. They're told how to vote, what to do, when to jump. And this explains why in the October 2014 parliamentary elections, the opposition bloc, which is mainly former party regions people, received its highest amount of votes in Mariupol. Because Akhmetov simply told all his workers how to vote, or they probably didn't even vote, he just collected all their ballot boxes. So that is a great example of how oligarchs continue to pollute and undermine Ukraine's parliamentary democracy. Beyond the opposition bloc, the communists are gone, they've fled to the Donetsk so-called People's Republic, and Ukrainian political forces, whether it's Poroshenko's bloc or Prime Minister Yatsenyuk's Popular Front, are very weak on the ground in that part of Ukraine. Maybe in the future they'll be stronger. In Volnovakhe itself, again, you have this kind of discrepancy. At the same time as you have a place full of Ukrainian troops, a very active civil society, supporting Ukrainian troops and supporting the refugees who have fled from separatist controlled areas, You still have a monument to Vladimir Lenin in Volnovakhe, and although there are attempts to pull it down, it's still there. The local head of the Rayon Council thinks there's no problem with keeping Lenin there. In Mariupol, four monuments to Lenin were pulled down, and after very kind of tense and brief battles to retake the town in May, June of 2014. And the town was retaken by the Azov Battalion. But certainly the mood in these areas, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as pro-Russian. There was a tremendous euphoria in the spring of 2014 in lots of areas in the Donbas, because the majority or a large number of the population believed that Vladimir Putin would invade and annex the Donbas like he did with the Crimea. So with what happened in the Crimea, there was an assumption that Vladimir Putin would do the same in the Donbas. This meant that the small number of activists, pro-Russian activists and Russian intelligence agencies were added to by a large euphoric crowd. Now that euphoria is now gone. One reason being that they can see that Putin doesn't want to take the Donbas. He wants the Donbas to remain in Ukraine and to create headaches and difficulties for Kiev. And secondly, because they have seen what war and destruction leads to. They don't want Mariupol or Volnovakhe or elsewhere to become a destroyed town like these other places with lots of civilian casualties. Akhmetov himself doesn't want that, because these metallurgical plants he controls, if the workers are forced to flee and the furnaces are closed, it costs millions of dollars to refire the furnaces. So he has an interest as well in keeping the separatists at bay. And so there's a huge number of people who are passive, and maybe not necessarily pro-Ukrainian, but they certainly don't want the separatists to try to retake, or separatists and Russian forces to try and take and invade Mariupol. Because it's certainly the case that the Ukrainian forces would not give up without a very strong fight. And such an invasion would lead to the collapse of the Minsk II agreement, and would lead to the inflow of large numbers of American military equipment. President Obama could no longer oppose that. And that's on the back of already what we have, which is 6 countries training Ukrainian forces at the moment. United States, Canada, Britain, Poland, Israel, and Georgia are there training. When I was in Kiev at a conference just prior to Mariupol, in my hotel in Kiev where the conference was being held, American Rangers troops, which are basically special forces, but in division-size special forces, their officers were staying in the same hotel, and when they left the hotel, they left with Polish officers. So there's already people on the ground giving advice and providing training. This means that Putin is working against a very bad clock, working against time, because the longer he waits to act, the less likely he's going to be successful, because Ukrainian forces are going to get better and better. They already defeated the separatists, and it was only because of a Russian invasion in August that the separatists were saved. But the longer he waits, the better trained and better equipped will be Ukrainian forces. And also, President Obama is not in power forever. He has another 18 months or so, and whoever takes power in the US, whether Democrat or Republican, is going to support the US Congress in the sending of military equipment to Ukraine. And once the US decides on that course, Canada and Britain and Poland will follow. So Putin is really working against the clock. He vastly underestimated the reaction of the West. He assumed the West would not really do anything, like he didn't do anything after Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. A year later, let's remember, in 2009, President Obama did a reset with Russia. So Russia got away with its invasion of Georgia. But so Putin completely miscalculated about Western responses to what happened in the Crimea and Donbas. And he's been told that if Minsk II collapses, then there will be no Minsk III. Sanctions will go to Tier 3, which is the level of the sanctions against Iran, and Germany and France no longer oppose the sending of US military equipment to Ukraine. So Putin is really miscalculated. He miscalculated about the high levels of public support amongst Russian speakers in so-called New Russia, when in fact pro-Ukrainian Russian speakers actually triumphed in places like Kharkiv and Odesa and Dnipropetrovsk. And so Putin is now left with this area of the Donbas he controls, has no economy, prices are skyrocketing, humanitarian catastrophe, which the Ukrainians are indirectly saying to him, you wanted that area, you've got it, now deal with it. And he's having to deal with that humanitarian crisis and economic crisis in the Donbas that he controls at a time when Russia itself is suffering from economic crisis and the impact of sanctions. So I think that we can have a relatively more optimistic view about the situation around Mariupol. I think Western journalists have speculated about a potential Russian invasion to create a land bridge, but that would be simply a bridge too far for Russia. And in that sense, Putin missed his opportunity. To do that, Putin should have invaded, like the public euphoria maybe wanted, in the spring of 2014. Then Ukrainian state barely existed. It had, in effect, in many ways disintegrated after the Euromaidan. But today the Ukrainian state is a lot stronger, and it will continue to become stronger. And Ukrainian military will continue to remain that. In that sense, down the road, historians might well in Ukraine be thanking Vladimir Putin for doing a great job in expanding Ukrainian patriotism into eastern and southern Ukraine among Russian speakers. We could actually do a three-stage depiction of Ukrainian national identity. If in the late 1980s, Ukrainian national identity was driven, and the drive to independence was primarily driven by Western Ukrainians. By the Orange Revolution, central Ukraine had been added to Western Ukraine, and that's why Yushchenko was able to win 52% with the support of Western and Central Ukraine. And today, we have the expansion of that national identity into Eastern and Southern Ukraine. And Vladimir Putin and his imperialist cronies simply do not understand the concept of a patriotic Russian-speaking Ukrainian. Because for him, they are just all Ruski, and therefore they should be all pro-Russian. And he obviously doesn't, or has never heard of countries such as Ireland that speaks English, or Scotland and Wales, or Austria that speaks German. But from that point of view, I think beyond small-scale conflict along the frozen conflict line, which will continue to exist, I very much doubt that there will be something bigger than that, which is good from the Ukrainian point of view, because then Ukraine can focus on its domestic problem areas such as economic, financial reform and fighting corruption. Thank you.